How can I make a difference? Throughout your life, how you answer this question changes. For college students, this question has high stakes.
We are well-intentioned adults, but we put a lot of pressure on teenagers to figure out their future, to figure out how they can, have an impact, maximize their impact.
Young adults today are navigating competing scripts and expectations for their lives, numerous options for their future, and a rising pressure to know their purpose now. It's exhausting. Today, we're addressing this. How can young people better ask and answer their most pressing questions of purpose? We interviewed Kara Powell, a researcher at Fuller Youth Institute and author of The 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. She has extensively studied Gen Z, today's college students and teenagers, and her research highlights the unique approach of this generation to questions of identity, belonging, and, most importantly for this season of the podcast, purpose. We discuss how young people can better determine their purpose in life, how they can prepare for that purpose to change, and what the Christian tradition might have to offer. This is the Veritas Forum podcast, a place for generous dialogue about the ideas that shape our lives. This season, we're exploring meaning and purpose. I'm your host, Carly Regal, and I'm the podcast producer for the Veritas Forum.
You've written so many books, Kara, but the one that we want to talk about today is the book, 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I read it was that you did a ton of research on this, surveys, focus groups, interviews. What was your research question? What were you trying to get to the bottom of when you set out to do this book, not knowing it would maybe be this book?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Bethany. So I love teenagers. I'm fascinated by teenagers. And one of the ways that I would describe teenagers is they are a walking bundle of questions, head to toe. They just have a lot of questions. And I want adults to understand what those deepest questions are. And unfortunately, a lot of times we as adults don't. As one 15-year-old said to a friend of mine, I wish adults would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking. I feel an ouch when I hear that. I wish adults would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking. So as you mentioned, we did surveys and interviews. We did deep dive one-on-one interviews with 27 very diverse teenagers from across the US to try to understand what are the questions beneath the questions. On any given day, a young person is asking questions about social media and what they're going to do on Friday night and maybe when they're next going to see their friends. But what are the questions beneath those questions? And that's where our research team at the Fuller Youth Institute, and especially my co-author, Brad Griffin, we were able to identify 3 big questions. And those are, first of all, a question of identity, who am I? Secondly, a question of belonging, where do I fit? And third, a question of purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. And I'll just say more and more, I'm seeing these questions not only as the 3 big questions of young people, but they're the 3 big questions of all people that are really fueling a lot of our actions and attitudes, regardless of our age. But, for young people, I would say for those of us over 30, these questions are maybe at a low simmer. But for those under 30, these questions are at a rolling boil.
Totally.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the fact that these 3 questions are not just questions for teenagers, although your title addresses that change every teenager. Kara, you're focused on Gen Z, thinking about their identity, belonging, and purpose, yet these are such big questions. How, in your mind, do you see Gen Z as unique in the way that they approach these questions?
Yeah. There's been so much research done on millennials, and I applaud that. And I think a lot of times we take that data and we accidentally also apply it to Gen Z. Our definition of Gen Z, they can of course vary, but our definition of Gen Z is those born after 2000. And so what we wanted to do is look at both academic and popular research on those born after 2000 and try to come up with helpful shorthand for those of us who want to understand young people better. And, really as few terms as possible that would adequately define this generation. So we landed on 3. First, this generation is an anxious generation. We were seeing this before the pandemic. We're seeing it even more in this stage of the pandemic. I will say, I don't know a family with teenage girls that's not dealing with mental health challenges. Boys are just a little bit behind, but still very high. So this is a generation that's really struggling with anxiety, stress, depression, suicidal ideation. And so this is an anxious generation. Secondly, this is an adaptive generation. This is a creative, entrepreneurial, passionate generation. And, we saw this during the pandemic too, that when young people had more time, they often did some pretty amazing things to try to influence the world around them, even if that was from their home or apartment. So this is an adaptive generation. And then thirdly, this is a diverse generation. In the midst of everything else that happened in 2020 here in the US, we also crossed a line according to US Census data. And now 50% of those under 18 are young people of color, and 50% are those who are white. So this is the most ethnically and racially and culturally diverse generation our nation has ever seen. So in the midst of these cross-generational questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, this generation is unique in that it's anxious, adaptive, and diverse.
We're going to come back to each of those points a little bit through some future questions. So I don't want you to think that I'm asking a different question that's unrelated. But as Carly and I were preparing for this conversation with you, Kara, we really zoned in on the purpose element. What is my purpose? Partly because, well, number one, in the book, you say that this is the easiest one for this generation to answer, this question, which was interesting in and of itself. There's this sense of a lot of driven students. They tend to be very driven on this idea of where they want to go, what the purpose is. But as Carly and I were reading, it seems to be that the purpose is only one aspect of the diamond. The other facets of belonging and identity, they almost inform each other. And so the question is, what happens when you only focus on one and you tend to neglect the importance of answering those other questions?
Yeah. Bethany, I'm glad you asked, because while it's helpful to parse them out, both in a discussion like this, as well as in our understanding of these three questions, they are very interrelated. So, one of the ways that we like to think about them is as a prism. And so at different time, light might shine on different aspects of that prism and more highlight, say, needs or opportunities in identity, belonging, and purpose. But they definitely do affect each other. Imagine the three with bidirectional arrows between them or among them. That identity affects belonging, which affects identity, which affects purpose, etc. We need to keep all three in mind while perhaps being attentive to unique seasons where one of those questions is more prevalent. And I'll just say, again, I'm over 30. And my kids are 22, 20, and 16. And both with our kids, as well as other teenagers at our church and our community, as well as myself, while all three questions are always active, I think there's often a leading question that is either, kind of how we're wired, or maybe it's the growth edge for us. And so my husband, for instance, when he hears about a tragedy in the world, like, he wants to grab his hammer and book a plane ticket and go there and serve tangibly, because he's very purpose oriented. Of course, he still navigates identity and belonging questions, but purpose is a little more primary. For me, a lot of my struggles actually in my life relate to my identity tensions. And so when I'm feeling heat about an issue, I stop and ask, is this identity, belonging, or purpose related? It's almost always identity related. That's kind of my growth area. So yes, they affect each other. They're embedded in each other. And yet sometimes it's helpful to be extra attentive to what's happening now for us in one of those questions.
Yeah. Because I would say, even that question your husband answering is a purpose question, but it's also, who am I in this crisis?
And he wants to go serve with other people. Like, that's part of why he loves serving, is because it's some of the greatest community experiences we've had and he's had. We're in the midst of serving. So that's a perfect example of how they are really all interrelated.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I love that little exercise of the gut check of identity, belonging, purpose. Where is this coming from? Just being open to those sorts of sources for sometimes the cloud of anxiety or feelings that we might be wading through. That's really helpful.
And I'll say this, that some of my psych colleagues at Fuller Seminary where I teach, they would say that for all generations, but especially young people, belonging is even more influential in identity and purpose than the other way around. In other words, there's something about our community that has a disproportionate influence on our identity and our purpose than the other way around, which may indeed be true.
Yeah. So given the caveat that these identity, belonging, and purpose are all interrelated, keep that in your minds, podcast listeners.
If anything, it's like, go read the book to get the other two.
Exactly. Yes. So the question of purpose that you highlight in your book is, what difference can I make? And I really love the structure of your book because you start off with the question and then you give common answers that the people that you interviewed had to that question. So for the next few minutes of this interview, we want to hone in on those common answers.
One of the things you said earlier was that this group of students was adaptive. And what you said was that, yeah, you even saw that during COVID, where they basically, wherever they were, they took what they had and they kind of like brought it to the forefront to be what we might call activists. And of course, I thought in my head, it's actually quite charming. Young people necessarily don't have the kind of power to create institutional change. They're just going to step in where they can do it. A common answer to what is my purpose is I make a difference when I'm helping others. You just shared a great example of your husband helping others, but it tends to be that a lot of young people are driven by this helping others being almost synonymous, it seems like, with justice. And justice, obviously, that's not a new concept by any means. I'm a lawyer. I've been driven by justice from a young age as well. But it seems like this generation has a supercharged value of justice. I don't know if it was in your interviews, surveys, but what is it about justice that is so attractive to the generation?
Yeah. I'd love to start by defining justice. My favorite definition is restoring God's kingdom shalom, restoring God's flourishing, restoring to our culture, our world, to all of our systems, the type of holistic thriving that God intends. Sometimes, in fact, more often than not, when I'm speaking with teenagers, including my own, I'll define it as righting wrongs. That's a little bit more tangible for a concrete adolescent mind. And so I would say helping others is certainly part of justice. It's been said that service or helping others is giving somebody a glass of cold water who needs it. Justice is asking, why did they need that water in the first place? Why couldn't they get it for themselves? And how do we revolutionize systems so that everybody has access to water? So in other words, helping others is an important part, but justice is a more systemic approach. And teenagers were involved in both, honestly. There are some teenagers who were given a glass of water and others who were thinking about more systemic change. But I think part of why that's so important is because they want to make a difference. I mean, there's just a desire to make a difference. And that's often reinforced by external voices, by parents, by pastors, by teachers, by college admissions counselors who, are always thinking about that college application. And so I would say it's both an internal and an external desire to make the world a better place. I think what's fascinating is to see the diversity of ways that our interviewees were involved in helping others or justice work. So probably more than anything else, we heard about climate care and the way that young people are so mindful of our environment. In fact, one of the interviewees, and we've changed all the names, so I can give you the names in the books because they're not the real names, but Lily was one of the interviewees who our research team member was talking to her about climate change. And Lily, confessed that she was very passionate about climate change, but here she was drinking out of a plastic cup in the midst of the interview. But, Lily was mindful of that cup and what it meant. So climate care was probably the number one issue that folks were interested in. Close behind that would be race and culture. I think especially we did a lot of our interviews in the last 3 years or so in the midst of the George Floyd murder and all that that's meant for our world. I think there's been much more awakening of racial injustice. And so, one of the African-American young people that we interviewed, she was specifically working on raising awareness about mental health struggles for African Americans. She had dealt with some mental health challenges, and she wanted to help her Black friends and Black peers at school know more about, the unique ways that they are maybe navigating anxiety. So I would say those were two of the more dominant ways that young people wanted to help, was by stewarding our planet and then seeking racial equality and justice.
I'm curious. When I was in law school, I worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I did a whole case from voir dire, jury selection, all the way. It was a capital murder case. The guy had killed 2 people, and I was just a lowly legal intern. And so I sat with the victims' families, both the victims' families, and got to know them a little bit. They both had a son that had died. And I remember being in the bathroom at one point during the trial and talking to one of the sisters of one of the victims, and she was crying. And she looked at me and she said, Bethany, no matter what this judge decides, no matter what this jury decides, nothing will bring back my brother.
Right.
And I thought, there is this difference. You describe justice as bringing about God's shalom. But there's what Steve Garber, an author I really like, he talks about this idea of proximate justice. We can't bring back somebody from who's dead. We can only hope to have the justice that can be brought about by our legal system, which actually is not full God shalom true justice at all. And so I was curious whether in this downsides of pursuing justice with this generation, in your interviews in particular, I'm thinking about, gosh, if you put your hope and your purpose in pursuing that perfect justice, did you see any kind of disconnect between what they could do and what they wanted, if that makes sense, their aspirations versus the reality?
I think, and this is where adults journeying with, or as our Catholic friends describe it so well, accompanying. This is where adults accompanying young people in their identity, belonging, and purpose journey is so important. Because I think, and I've seen, and we saw in our data, that there is a disillusionment. Maybe it's not as stark as the murder victim's sister realizing that she'll never see her brother again. But it's Lily saying, I care about climate care, but I'm still drinking out of a cup. And so there's these kind of conflicting mixed messages, which is where an adult presence to listen, to process, and really that's why we wrote the book, isn't just for information, but for relationship's sake. That for podcast listeners, for any adult who wants to have a deeper relationship with a young person and talk to them about their purpose, whether it's disillusionment, or I'll tell you, the other thing we saw quite a bit in terms of a downside of purpose is exhaustion. That there are a lot of young people who are so wanting to change the world for often really good internal reasons as well as external reasons related to living up to adult expectations, or again, maybe that college application. That, our guess is about 1/3 of our interviewees were serving so much that their own health suffered, that their mental, physical, and emotional health was deteriorating. I remember one really amazing high school senior who I interviewed. We call him Sebastian in the book. He's serving as a church intern, which, is wonderful. And he's making a little bit of money. And yet he's so busy serving. What he said was his goal is so that the pastor is fine and she doesn't have to worry about anything. So he wants her to be able to relax and focus on her sermon. And he's going to worry about everything. So, a typical Sunday for him can be involved being at church from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. without a lot of time with church friends. And he's literally at the sound booth in the back of the worship space. And so, on the one hand, gosh, Sebastian's dedication to this church is remarkable and et cetera, but that's not sustainable for anybody, let alone a 17-year-old. This is another role for us as adults, is we're accompanying young people, is making sure that their schedule is sustainable and knowing, how to intervene and how to help that young person find some downtime, find some rest, find balance, whatever that looks like, in the midst of all they want to do to help our world.
I think the point of exhaustion is so salient when you think about mental health crisis and young people and anxiety. It's interesting because I think this flows very easily into the second common answer, which is I make a difference when I follow a script. So kind of thinking about this exhaustion. If you have your idea of purpose rooted in helping others, but then you're so exhausted that you don't even know if you can make it to the finish line of helping the person how you want, maybe your switch in your mind is like, well, at the end of the day, it's not really about whether or not the person is ultimately helped. I understand that I've got limitations in my time and agency in this, but if I have this idea of a script in my mind where I am a good person because I, spend 15 hours a week volunteering, the script is just so helpful if you're facing those mental health challenges or feeling that anxiety or that exhaustion. I was curious if you had any more insight into how students address this script idea, and if you saw that gap being bridged for the exhaustion and the mental health in this answer.
Again, we are well-intentioned adults, but we put a lot of pressure on teenagers to figure out their future, to figure out how they can, have an impact, maximize their impact. I'm a Christian, I'm a Jesus follower, and I'll never forget hearing a speaker named Louis Giglio talk about that. We use this phrase a lot in Christian circles where we say, we want to know God's will. And what is God's will? And there's a lot of adults saying that to young people, it's important to know God's will. I love what Louis Giglio says, where he says, for those of us who are Christians, we not only talk about God's will, but we talk about knowing if we're in the center of God's will. Because somehow being in the center of God's will, it's qualitatively better than being a couple degrees off center. And I think, man, how many times have I said that? Being in the center of God's will, which again is even more pressure on young people. So yes, absolutely. We estimate that the pressure to have a clear sense of future was mentioned by about a third of the students we interviewed, and especially seniors, those 12th graders who are looking ahead to life after college. And I'll say this, we were very mindful about having an ethnically and racially diverse sample. And students from families that more recently immigrated often feel greater pressure to perform or achieve because of the sacrifices their family made to move to the US. Sometimes the parent will remind the child of the sacrifices made, but often the child is just seeing it. And Claudia is one young person we interviewed who is so grateful to her mom for giving Claudia opportunities for education beyond what she was likely to experience in Mexico, where they're from. But now Claudia feels this pressure to have at least a better future and education than her mom did. And then also in immigrant families and families of color, there's often a family script that mandates taking care of younger siblings. So we heard this from some of our young people of color that, they did a long day at school, then they rushed home after school because they were childcare for younger siblings while their parents were working one or two or more jobs. And so, again, that's purposeful. And on the one hand, gosh, how meaningful to contribute to the family like that. But on the other hand, that creates a level of anxiety that can be a lot for a teenager to handle.
It is a lot, Kara. I used to coach college students on what they were going to do after college. And like you said, a lot of high school seniors feel this. I used to say that 70% of my job coaching college seniors about to graduate was managing fear. It was not about actually what they were going to do. They were just afraid to leave the script because their script had gone from kindergarten to college senior. And so many of especially good students would come to me and they thought, I just want to go to grad school, because that was a way to continue the script versus actually like stepping out and taking a risk and finding a job. So it's super relevant to the students we work with.
For sure.
Yeah. Ultimately, when we're thinking about a script has an end. When you were talking with students, did they have a sense of an end to their script or any sort of long-term implications of rooting their purpose in this answer?
Yeah. Well, I think Bethany identified it. It's often when I graduate from high school or when I graduate from college, although again, in some particular ethnicities and cultures, those expectations can extend until I'm married, et cetera. What was encouraging is whether it was at that point or earlier on, when young people felt agency to choose at least some of what happened in their lives, that was really meaningful to them. And, I will say, while agency isn't a word that a lot of teenagers know, it's one that those of us who interact with teenagers should definitely have in mind. How do we increase this young person's sense of choice and actual choice in developing their own interests and goals and values? I mentioned Claudia earlier. She was pretty humorous. In fact, I have a quote handy that I'd love to read you, how she was able to kind of change the script. Initially, she wanted to be a vet. And then I'm going to start a quote from her. But then I saw a documentary about a lady who died because this cat with a virus in its claw scratched her. I was like, no, I am not trying to die. So then I was interested in being an attorney, but the law changes every week. So no, that's not it. Then I realized I like to read and write and talk about what's going on in the world. So I thought I could pursue creative writing and journalism. That way I can motivate people to take action, like with the burning of the Amazon rainforest. So now that's what I want to do. And I want to hear it in Claudia's own words, because that's how, I think she was 16 or 17. That's how someone that age thinks, right? And again, what I want from Claudia is not only, or what I want for Claudia is not only the freedom to have this evolution, but an adult who is walking alongside her. And, it could be a niece or a nephew, an aunt and uncle, a member at church, a neighbor, whoever, a teacher, a parent, whoever it might be, who, gosh, Claudia, what do you like about being a vet? Well, how does that align with your skills and your passions? Well, what else do you think could align with your skills and your passions? Claudia's narrative didn't include an adult journeying with her through that. And that's what we hope to see with all questions, identity, belonging, and purpose, is that those of us over 30, or those of us over high school graduation, that we are that safe space to process some of what they're navigating.
Well, and frankly, just being an adult, at least in my case, doesn't mean that I know how to make good career decisions. I've been really helped with the work of Dave Evans, who we also have featured on the podcast, about how do you make career decisions. What's the best tool you can use that's flexible, that allows you to change in these ways, which is really helpful.
Totally. No, that makes great sense.
Yeah, I love that you shared the Claudia's journey, her changing her mind, thinking about different things, incorporating different information. And I think that leads into this third common answer that you discussed in your book, which is, I make a difference when I'm headed towards a good future. And I think sort of a little bit of Claudia's own workings. She's trying to find that good future for herself. And obviously having mentors guide and shape that is essential. One thing that you bring up in this common answer, though, is this idea called an optimism gap. And both Bethany and I were really...
This was fascinating.
Yeah, we were struck by this in your book. And I was wondering if you could introduce our podcast listeners to what an optimism gap is.
Yeah. Well, we didn't come up with the term. Sophia Pink did, who drove across the U.S. interviewing 21-year-olds. And she describes the optimism gap as this: the future of our world is bleak, but my future is bright. So in other words, young adults, and we saw this some in our interviews too, they use words like scary, destruction, maybe even dumpster fire to describe what's happening in America, or what they expect will happen in America. But then when they imagine their own futures, responses were more like hopeful or determined and loving. So, and again, there are certainly some young people who are more pessimistic about their own future than the future of America. But we saw the reverse more often, or the inverse more often, that, like Sophia Pink describes, that young people are actually a little more optimistic, or a lot more optimistic about their own future than the future of our country. Which again, if I had to choose one extreme or the other, I want young people to be optimistic about their future, because that can help give them a sense of agency and hope, energy, passion to explore different options. So again, this is something I think we can build on as those of us who are walking alongside young people, is the way that most young people have a pretty core belief in their own abilities and skills.
When you say agency, do you think that's because people have more control over their individual choices? If you try to think about changing the whole country, it just feels like I have no agency over that piece of it. Do you think that's the dissonance?
That's probably a large part of it. I'm a researcher, so I'm not going to speculate too much. And I'll make all sorts of qualified statements here, Bethany. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it is, there's your circle of control and your circle of influence. And I have more control and influence over my own life and choices than I do the rest of our country. I'm not going to get into all the causes why this is true, but I also think what tends to be talked about in our world and in our country also reinforce that. If you just watch the news or social media headlines, it's normally bad news that we're hearing about our world. But generally, if you look at individual social media feeds, it's generally more encouraging. So, I think there is a sense that people have about themselves as individuals and maybe others close to them that is more positive than the headlines they're seeing about our country and world.
You're right. Arthur Brooks up at Harvard says that there's actually research that shows the more local the news is, the more positive it is.
Ah, interesting.
A neighborhood blog is going to the cat was caught, or the lost cat was caught. So anyway.
Yeah.
Wrapping up this idea of purpose, we are thinking these various answers of I have a script, I'm helping people, the various replies. One of the things you mentioned in the book is there's an even better, and I don't even know if these are the right adjectives, but better or more fulfilling type of response that we can have if we incorporate. The assumption is if we are human beings, recognizing we are made in God's image, and there is not only a story that I can tell that's right here in my world, but there's this huge cosmic story. What does that look like for this purpose, even an individual purpose, to be thrown into this massive, cosmic, timeless kind of this huge idea of God's story of what he's doing in the world?
Yeah. Thanks for letting me talk a little bit about something that was important to us in the book. Is we not only describe young people's current answers to these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, but that we also get to describe what we think are better answers. And as a person of faith, as a Christian, I think Jesus's answers offer the best answers. And one of my favorite verses in scripture is John 10:10, where Jesus talks about the abundant life that comes from following him. And, for folks who aren't Jesus followers, I think there's still a really important question, like, what is the answer that really helps you come alive? I think of the Howard Thurman quote, "The world needs people who have come alive." And so how, across faiths, how do we come alive to the best possible answers? So I think that's a fascinating starting point for all of us. And I alluded to this before, but for all of us to ask ourselves, which of these three questions, they're all prevalent, but which of these three questions is most heated for us? And how do we find better answers? So for me, when I feel insecure about something, it's almost always an identity question. And I don't generally feel insecure in my role as a leader or a researcher. Where I really tend to feel it is as a mom. I stack up all the mistakes I know about myself as a mom against all the successes that I see in other moms and other parents and think, oh, I don't measure up. I'm not good enough. And what we say in the book is a better answer when young people don't feel like they measure up. When I, as a mom of young people, don't feel like I measure up, how do I really lean into knowing that God makes me enough? In fact, God makes me more than enough. And as I can lean into that, as I can meditate on that, as I can pray through that, as I can have others remind me of that, I stand on that answer more firmly. And so, one of the best gifts that we can give the young people we care about is to stay curious, not just about young people, but about ourselves. And always be asking, how am I growing? In fact, this is a question I've started now asking with people I supervise in my work. Like, let's talk about how you and I are growing, how you're growing and how I'm growing in our identity, belonging, and purpose. I mean, this is just more and more a lens through which I'm seeing all of us, regardless of age, continue to grow. And so let's give young people the gift of our own awareness and our own curiosity and our own growth as we try to accompany them through their growth.
I listened to another conversation you had with a podcast, And you actually mentioned in there that the more you're asking those questions as an adult, you found the better you are in engaging young people for the same things.
I understand them so much better. I mean, truly, again, we'll talk about my own kids who are in college and high school. Like when one of my kids is doing something that doesn't make sense, or another young person I know is doing something that seems a little askew from who they are, if I stop and ask, okay, are they seeking identity? Are they seeking belonging? Or are they seeking purpose? That helps me understand them better. And, I found it's very powerful for me to share my own journey with young people. The young people closest to me know my identity struggles. And I think it creates a sense of empathy and mutual growth that's really important for any relationship, including a relationship across generations. So yeah, our self-awareness and our empathy are two of the biggest gifts we can give young people.
As a young person myself, I know that you have experience, Kara, on the mentor side. Do you have any advice for maybe young people who are listening to this? They are curious about identity, belonging, and purpose. What are some good next steps or places where they can learn how to engage more fully in these big questions?
Yeah. Well, there's a book called 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. That is always a go-to place. But I would actually add to that, I'm glad you brought up mentoring, because one of my favorite ways, whether I'm mentoring somebody or want to be mentored by somebody, is I try to be as specific as I can in what I hope to learn from that person. So, we are all busy people. And when a 22-year-old comes to me and says, can you mentor me? My follow-up question is always, tell me what you want to be mentored in, and I'll see if it feels like something I can help you in. And so, for a younger person who wants to grow in these questions, I would say, ask yourself, do I want to grow in identity, belonging, or purpose? And then ask, who's an adult who I feel like has grown in these areas, who I can go to and say, hey, I'd like to grow in this. It seems like you'd have something that I could learn from you. Can we meet a couple times so I can learn from you? And so, what I'm saying is, if you want to grow, I'd recommend grow from somebody else and be as specific as you can in what you hope you can learn. Because that makes it, at least for me, that makes it a whole lot more tenable to say yes when I know what's being asked of me and when I feel like it's in the strike zone of who I am.
So far this season, we've explored how and where we can find purpose and meaning. But creating purpose is only part of the equation. Given the often challenging world we live in, we have to learn how to keep purpose too. Next week, you'll hear about just that. We're sharing a forum on mental health from the University of Minnesota featuring psychiatrist Kurt Thompson. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, take a second to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. We love hearing from you. Our production is led by me, Carly Regal, and the team at Resonate Recordings. Thanks to Bethany Jenkins and Seth Bollinger for providing content editing and audio support for this episode, and to Heather Beloga for coordinating all of our production needs. Thanks to our guest today, Kara Powell. It was great getting to chat about your research and explore this question of purpose in a deeper way. You can order a copy of her book, The 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, using the link in the podcast description. Thanks also to our incredible partners who help support Veritas and make sure these conversations are possible. And a final thanks goes to you, the listener. Thanks for listening as we explore the ideas that shape our lives.